we're excited to welcome Phillip Thompson here with us today on West of the Page. Phillip has written a great story for our anthology, for the Hard Country anthology that's being released soon, called Get Out of Denver. And I love that. It's just kind of clear that somebody's got something going on. Do you want to tell us a little bit about your story?
Sure. Thanks for inviting me to be on the podcast and the video. So the story sort of came to me as I was standing in a hotel room in Denver, looking out the window, thinking, boy, I need to get out of here because there were a lot of fires on the West Coast at the time. And so the view from my window, I couldn't see the Rocky Mountains. All I could see was smoke. And I just thought when I said that, I was like, I need to get out of Denver. Okay, I can probably work with that. And I just wrote it down, put it in a notebook, and put it away for the rest of my trip. And then, like writers do, I started pulling at a thread and eventually built the story around that. But that's the origin of both the title and then the setting and sort of the driving force behind the story.
So Marty's your main character.
Marty Franks.
He is kind of involved with the mob and some gambling and some debts. There's some betrayal. I'm really loving a lot of the things going on in the story. Can you tell me what kind of a little more about Marty's story and what's going on with him there?
Yeah, Marty is kind of a guy who thinks he's a good guy, and he thinks that while he might be doing some things that are a little shady, he's not necessarily above the fray, but he's apart from it. He knows who he works for. He works for a Miami mob boss, and he's the accountant. He's not a muscle guy. He's not a made man. He's not even Italian, for crying out loud. No offense for the stereotypes there. But he's sort of mob adjacent, at least in his own mind. He's mob adjacent. And sure, he gambles, on the side, and he keeps that separate from, he thinks he keeps that separate from, his mob bosses and associates. But he's not doing anybody any harm, again, in his mind. But as the story unfolds, we see that Marty's actually harming himself and several other people around him, both with his associations and with his addictions. And he operates in.
I love that Marty is like so clever and he's so intelligent. But like you said, in his head, he thinks he's a good guy, just maybe kind of right in the line. So I want to know, like, how does a character like that end up making such kind of risky decisions and letting things get out of hand? How do you balance that with him being so clever at the same time?
Well, we've all known very clever people in our lives, and the saying you're too smart for your own good. I think Marty's biggest failing is his own hubris that has blinded him to what's really going on. And we can spend a lot of our time sometimes being so focused, or maybe not focused, but so self-insulated from what's really going on around us, that you kind of forget that actions, have reactions, and they also have consequences. He's not necessarily a guy that walks around thinking about consequences and reactions, much to his chagrin.
It's kind of like that idea, almost like your greatest trait can become your greatest flaw, right? He thinks he's almost like he's so smart that it couldn't possibly get out of hand that way, right?
Right.
You think that maybe ties into him starting to work with Charlie, that kind of influences his decision to work with him in the end?
Yeah, I think so. Just because even though he knows who he is or who he works for and who he associates with, and I'm talking about Marty now, not Charlie, but Marty thinks, yeah, it's fine. Yeah, I know what he does, and I know this is not somebody I'd want to go to church with or go fishing with, but I'm not part of that. And so I'm going to be treated in a different way. I'm special, the terminal uniqueness definitely has its grip on people like Marty and Marty in particular.
This is such a fun story. I love
Well,
the
thank you.
kind of the background behind it. Tell us a little bit about your background and how you kind of came into writing these kinds of stories.
I grew up in the Deep South, as you probably have guessed just from hearing me speak for a few minutes.
Yeah, I noticed there's a little bit of an accent there.
Yeah, I grew up in the rural part of East Mississippi. And graduated from college. I went to Ole Miss, and then I went straight into the Marine Corps for a few years. I started writing probably in the 8th or 9th grade, just for myself. So it's always been something that I wanted to do. And, many years later, after I got out of the Marine Corps, and moved back briefly to Mississippi, got a job with a newspaper, was a reporter, was an editor, moved to Virginia doing the same thing, working for newspapers. Always with the intention of writing stories of some sort. And I was really, really influenced by a lot of the great crime fiction writers, John MacDonald and Elmore Leonard and Jim Thompson, and just a whole cavalcade of great crime fiction writers. And that was always something that appealed to me. And I also learned that as much as I tried to write the great American novel, I just couldn't do it. I'm not a literary novel writing person. So I started writing crime fiction stories. And I always, everybody has a sense of place or a sense of where they're from. And I knew I wanted to bring that into, whatever I write, which, by the way, this story is a little bit different from what I would normally write because it takes place in two, large cities. And the kind of novel length writing that I do, and a lot of my short stories are based in a very specific part of the South and in a very, very specific demographic circle or demographic stratum. But it's just been something that I always wanted to do. I got very fortunate when I wrote a few novels, a series of novels about a Mississippi sheriff who grapples with his own demons and his own sense of justice in the town and in the area that he happens to operate in. And it was really fun to kind of take that very real universe, that very real area that I grew up in, and fictionalizing it to a degree that I can put these characters in, put them in situations, and then see how they react to it.
So was that a challenge for you to kind of reach outside of that demographic a little further, or do you feel like you're familiar enough with those cities to feel like you could kind of embed yourself into that setting?
A little bit of everything you said. Yes, it was a challenge to step outside of my, small backwoods universe, for lack of a better phrase. And both Miami and Denver, oddly enough, I'm only faintly familiar with. I have a sister that lives in the Miami area, and she has also lived in Denver. And I was in Denver, to see my sister at the time that the idea for the story came. But I tried not to worry too much about the intense accuracy of Miami or Denver and focus more on the characters, because really wherever you are, the character is going to be a person who is that person, regardless of his location. But I wanted to see if I could do that, a different location, a bigger city, because I know several really, really good writers out in LA, and I lived in LA for a couple of years, but I'm not an LA crime noir writer. I don't know the city like you need to know it to write something like that. But in this case, I decided to take myself on as a challenge and say, can I at least anchor the character in this city and pull it off? So hopefully that worked.
I definitely think you pulled it off. I especially love that, like you said, kind of noir feeling to it with the mob and, the gambling and the debts. Is that something that, was tied to your idea to set it somewhere else, or what kind of brought that aspect into it for you?
Well, I had to, once I got the title in my head, and I have to, full disclosure, I didn't invent the title. It's the title of an old Bob Seger song, which I love and adore. So it's like, okay, yeah, I'm gonna do this. But yeah, I was trying everything that I could to just to see if I could actually put that character there, and then what would I do if he was in Miami? And I knew I didn't want to go back to the 80s and do Miami Vice, but there are certain influences in both Miami and Denver that I thought, okay, I think I can wrap this into that using these particular tropes, if you want to call them that. And I always like writing noirish stuff that leans more toward the dark than anything else. And that seemed like a good way to do it. The gambling seemed like a really good way to at least get into the story.
Good way to get him into trouble, right?
Yeah, and always a good way to get him in trouble. Always.
I'm thinking about your background, and I'm a Marine Corps and a Senate aide, and all these varied things. How did you go from that to writing?
Well, I think the writing started first.
Okay, yeah, because you mentioned 8th and 9th grade.
Yeah, and I had, I consider myself lucky on so many levels. I had very, very good teachers. I had an 8th grade teacher, Miss Barbara Pittman, and I was in a creative, it was not really, they didn't call it creative writing, but it was an English class, but it was heavily weighted toward, creativity. And she encouraged all of us, to create in whatever way, we felt we could. And that's when I wrote, your typical 8th grader story. And then in high school, I had, fantastic teachers, English teachers in particular, Miss Digby, and then Miss Coffey my senior year, who introduced me to the world of Shakespeare, which has never loosened its grip on me. And so as I'm reading and writing and trying to create, the writing just came, naturally. The idea of writing came naturally to me. Now the process was not always easy, but yeah, my love for it started when I was really, really young. So even going into college, I knew I wanted to continue that. I didn't want to get an English degree at the time. I got a journalism degree, which is like, lazy English, but it's English without all the hard work. But I got a journalism degree, and of course, I had that, and Marine Corps decided, well, if you have a journalism degree, a nice liberal arts degree, we're going to put you in the most math intensive job we can think of, which was the artillery, which, perfect fit, right? Perfect.
Oh, obviously.
So here I am, a journalism graduate in learning trigonometry all over again. But even so, I was constantly thinking about writing, and actually wrote a few. They were historical pieces, but I wrote for a couple of Civil War magazines at the time, and some other publications. I always had a pen in my hand, and continued that when I got out of the Marine Corps. So I've always been writing something since literally the 8th grade.
Well, you mentioned, having to relearn certain math concepts, and also how to learn how the process of writing. Do you think that, having to relearn some technical skills for your career in the Marine Corps fed into you knowing how you learn and being able to build your own kind of process for writing?
Probably. I've never really thought about it in those terms, but I'm sure that it did. It definitely. The Marine Corps definitely taught me how to focus on a specific task. Because like a lot of people who create or write, musicians, sculptors, whomever, we tend to be a little disorganized and wear that as a badge of honor. Well, yeah, it's messy because I'm creative. Well, you don't get away with that when you're in the middle of a field exercise and you're dealing with artillery weapons. You have to be very focused on the task at hand, and there is a process and a procedure that you do over and over and over until you can literally do it, under the worst possible circumstances. And I think that did transfer. It gave me the ability to sit down in a room alone and really focus on, well, at the time, the blank page. Now it's the blank screen, but it's the same thing. And where I could really sit in a room and focus for one solid, hour, whether I wrote 15 words or 15 pages, I'm going to spend this hour focused on that. So, learning behavioral skills like that definitely helped. And then I do think that one thing that a lot of writers, or some writers, especially brand new ones, tend to overlook is, for me, the most important thing I can do as a writer is read. And the older I've gotten, life kind of gets in the way, and I don't have the time that I would love to read like I did when I was young. But when I was in the Marine Corps, there were many, many times when I would be, sitting on a sea bag waiting for something to happen. I'd pull out a book. And I was stationed aboard a ship for 2 years, and those are very long days and nights at sea. Always had a book. One of the shelves behind me is filled with books that I bought when I was on that ship, and I've read every one of them, half a dozen times. So that process of reading and reading and reading and learning, oh, this is pace. Oh, this is dialogue. That's how you build a plot. That was really helpful. Especially when I was reading John D. McDonald's Travis McGee series. That was the thing that made me say, I think I want to do that. I want to write a series of books about one character and just throw everything I can at him and see what happens to him in those situations. But yeah, those were a couple of skills that I, absorbed in the Marine Corps that really served me well when I was writing.
I love that advice, especially for new writers. Like when you're faced with that blank page, it can be quite intimidating. And knowing at least, you could always spend your time reading. That's always a good endeavor. That's always going to be helpful.
Yep. Always helpful. Always. I mean, I learned everything I know about writing dialogue. I learned it from reading Elmore Leonard's books. He's the master at it.
Yeah.
So that just sort of, learning by osmosis, I got a hold of that, and that was really helpful. So you're always learning something when you're reading, because it's going to stir you to write something. Mm-hmm. At least it does with me. There's been 1,000 times when I'm reading and I'm 20 pages into something, and then it hits me. Oh, I need to write this down, and I'll grab a notebook and scribble something down, and then go back to the book.
So you talked about picking up your pen and writing back in the day. I'd love to kind of know your process now. How do you start with a story or creating and work your way through that process?
Usually it starts with a notebook, and it's just scribbling down ideas. Usually that's what happens. I also use my computer quite a bit. I've got a program on my laptop that helps me set up like a cork board for outlining, and I'll usually start with the germ of an idea, and it can be something like, I'm staring at a hotel room in Denver and I need to get out of here. All right, I'll write that down, and then I'll think about it, and then when I'm ready, then I'll really dedicate an hour or two of time to write an outline, and I'll heavily outline the entire thing, whether it's a short story or a novel, and novels in particular take a little bit more time, but I'll set up an outline, and it's not the indented outline that we learn in school, but it's more like a narrative. And it can be sometimes, if it's a novel, it might be a 20 or a 25 page outline. I go very detailed, and write it all down, and let it sit, go back and edit it for a little bit. And then when I'm satisfied with the outline, then I'll start actually writing. And that's when I actually do. I use a pencil and a notebook, and I write longhand. I write everything longhand. And I think better when I'm doing that. I make less spelling and typos when I'm doing that. And then when I finally input it into, a Word document, that becomes my first edit. And then I usually go from there. Once it's finished, then it's all on the screen. The edits and the rereads are all on screen, and I put the note, just put the notebook down.
It makes me really happy that you're doing things kind of that old school way with just a pen and a paper. That's how I like to write and how I like to get started as well. And that's how I edit too. So that makes me really happy to hear somebody else kind of there's something about the pen on the paper that's just really kind of creates some nice flow. So that's great.
Yeah, and it makes you feel like you're actually doing the writing. To me, it does. And I'm glad you said you liked it too. For a couple of years, I thought I was kind of the only person left doing that. And the more I mentioned it, the more writers I found that do it as well. And I'm like, oh, great, there's a whole bunch of us. And it is pretty effective. It does give your brain the flow that it needs to sort of think as you write. Because when I'm typing, I can't necessarily think in the same way, because I know when I misspell a word with my fingers on the keyboard. Then I got to stop and go back and rewrite it, because I'm a little OCD that way. But when I'm just writing it, all I have to do is erase and write it again. So it works out well for me.
So when you were plotting out and outlining this story, did you kind of always have an ending in mind as you were going along? I'm curious if you ever, in this case or with other novels or stories you've written, do you ever get through your outline and then kind of are surprised that, oh, you know what? Actually, I think this is going to happen instead. Does that ever happen to you, or you have such a structured, perfect outline that you're happy to stick to it?
No, it almost, okay, 100%, it's going to change. And that's why I'm glad it's an outline. Basically, the outline kind of corrals my mind and gives me a place to start, and then it gives me the right and left limits. And if I can stay inside those right and left limits, then yes, things are going to change. In this case, I did not necessarily have a hard end when I wrote the outline. It was a very quick outline. I wrote it on a plane coming back from Denver, actually. And I said, okay, I'm going to do this, 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 and this. And then the end's going to be, I think originally I wanted Marty to be back in Miami looking out over his empty pool. And it would be obvious that it was just Marty. His wife was gone, and it was just him in this fancy house overlooking his very empty swimming pool. But as I started developing Marty and writing him out, I realized, no, it really can't end that way. So, and that happens a lot. There are plenty of times. Yesterday morning, in fact, when I was writing something different, a lot of times I know who the characters I'm going to write about are going to be. Okay, Joe and Bob are in a bar, and that's where I'll start. I have no idea what Joe and Bob are going to say to each other, or who's going to throw the first punch, if there's going to be a first punch. Is the law coming? But as I'm writing it, it starts to come out. But I've got the outline there. The outline said Joe and Bob go into a bar. And that gets me, going to that.
Well, I love that you said like your outline, kind of sets the limits on the left and the right. And I think that's partially what's so intimidating starting with nothing, is that you could go any direction. So it's almost like, you're able to set up your own limits, and then those constraints often, I feel like, can make you more creative, can allow you to
Oh, I
go
think
other
so.
places
Yeah.
when you know you have to stay in that lane. So I love
Yeah.
that.
And, there's the old outliners versus pantsers, writers. And, when I was attempting to write a first novel, I scoffed at the idea of, writing being a plotter and writing an outline and this and that. And man, oh, sure, I could write the first draft, but the editing was a
Yeah.
nightmare because nothing made sense and nothing connected. And so then over time and with the help of a very, very, let's say detail oriented editor, I was like, maybe I need to write an outline next time. And that's what I did. And it makes it so much easier. But yeah, even so, just because you write it, in March as an outline, it doesn't mean that in June, well, I'm going to change that. And sometimes it does, but it's very helpful to know where your right and left limits are, I think.
I love that you called out the editors, because Janae is one of our editors.
Yes.
Well, I used to be one too, so
Okay. So you feel it.
And it's a whole different world, right?
yeah, and everybody in the world needs an editor, especially the people who think they don't. And you just have to. Sometimes you have to be gentle, and sometimes you can't be. So yeah, I always take it. I take it in stride. I'm a very collaborative person. When you get to that end of the process, I might not agree, or I might say, "Oh, I didn't think about that. Maybe, yeah, let's do that." I try not to take it personally. Working in a newsroom for, quite a few years will cure you of that. Everybody's going to get edited, and it's not personal. It's just business.
Yep. That's a hard conclusion to come to, that,
Yeah.
you're taking something so personal and you're opening it up to collaboration, which is not always easy, but
Yeah.
yep. The goal is always get it better, right?
Right.
I had a mentor that always said the magic happens in revision. And so I think it's really important that we keep that in mind as we're working on things. So I think that's a great way to look at it. We can all improve.
Yeah, definitely.
So I wanted to ask you about this story in particular, that's going in this anthology. And I wanted to ask you how you feel about it supporting the U.S. Marshals Museum, and how you decided to incorporate that into the story.
I was really flattered and honored when Revis Wortham asked me, he forwarded me on the information, asked me if I wanted to participate. And he told me, that it was for the U.S. Marshals Museum Fund. And I said, yeah, absolutely. I wouldn't mind meeting Raylan Givens if I ever get a chance, my favorite Marshal. But, I think it works out really well. The series that I wrote, the Colt Harper series about Sheriff Colt Harper, he's a law enforcement guy. And I grew up watching Westerns, and I'm old enough to where there was a time when every other show on TV was a Western. So, I grew up in that environment, and, the Marshals always seem to be sort of in the line of Texas Rangers. They're not New York City beat cops. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but they're this different kind of breed. So I always kind of looked at them with a certain amount of reverence, I guess, or admiration. I knew several Marines that got out of the Marine Corps and became U.S. Marshals. So I was really interested and excited rather to be a part of it. And I'm not a Western writer. I don't write what a lot of people think of when you say Western stories or Western TV. But oddly enough, all four of my Colt Harper novels, even though they're set in Mississippi and they're set in modern times, a fictionalized modern time, but they're not out west. They're not cowboy stories. They're not martial stories. And I never wrote them to be that. I wrote them as just Southern crime noir novels. But I have gotten a lot of readers and readers' comments that are big Westerns fans. They did really well with people who like Westerns. And were even marketed at one time as sort of a neo-Western. I'm not sure exactly what that means, but but it worked. So who is I to complain? But yeah, and there's an argument that could be made that most stories are Westerns. I think Star Wars was a Western when you really break it down. So I was very excited when I got an email from. I'm always excited to get an email from Revis, but when I got that one, I was particularly excited.
Thank you so much for being here today and for spending some time with us. I'd love to ask you one final question.
Okay.
If you had a favorite book that you read growing up, or something that was just really unique and different than what everybody else would expect, what would that have been?
This is going to be, I don't want to say counterintuitive, but it's going to sound different from everything we've talked about up to this point. It was when I was in high school. I read a book called Once an Eagle by Anton Myrer, and I found the book because of a TV miniseries. Sam Elliott and Darlene Carr and Cliff Potts starred in it back in the 70s, I believe it was. And it's about this military guy from Nebraska, this farm boy from Nebraska, joins the army during World War One, and then he is the epitome of righteousness and virtue. And he is opposite another soldier named Courtney Massengale, played brilliantly by Cliff Potts, who is the embodiment of the opposite, the ambitious, conniving, evil force. And they are opposite each other for their entire military careers, for the next 30 years. And, Sam Damon, the good guy, always chose the right, always. And the leadership that was described in that novel, it had a grip on me, as a young kid. And then I took that into the Marine Corps with me, that I wanted to be that kind of leader, whether or not I succeeded, but that was always my goal, was to be that type of leader. And the book's on my shelf behind me. I've read it and highlighted it so many times that I had to get a second copy and reread it so I could read clean pages. And I bet you I've gone through 4 copies of it, the paperback. That book probably has had more impact on me than any of the rest. And there's nothing wrong with any of the rest that I've read, but that one's the one that comes to mind.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Would you repeat the name of the novel and the author one more time?
Sure. It was called Once an Eagle, and it was written by Anton Myrer, Myrer. Forgive the accent.
Love that. Well, thank you so much for coming and joining us today. We're really looking forward to having all of the stories, and especially this one in the anthology coming out.
Thank you. It was a lot of fun to be here. It was a great pleasure and honor to be able to write the story and to be included in this anthology. So thank you very much.